For 25 years, Charles Sanders lived with the ghost of his older sister, Carolyn. She and her fiancé vanished from a seaside restaurant in 1990. A tragedy officially ruled a drowning accident after a rogue wave supposedly swept them from the pier. But Charles, only a teen at the time, never believed it. Now, a call from the Coast Guard changes everything. A recent seismic survey has revealed a massive debris field on the seabed, the unmistakable wreckage of that same restaurant, thought to have been demolished years ago, but was actually ripped from its pilings and sunk whole in that fateful storm. It's amazing how a single phone call can make decades of carefully built walls crumble into dust. If you've ever had a moment that changed everything, you know the feeling. I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. The hum of the server room was the background music to Charles's life. As a partner in one of Seattle's most respected maritime law firms, his world was one of contracts, regulations, and the predictable churn of international shipping. It was a world of order, a fortress of logic he had built around himself since the chaos of June 1990. He was 42 now, with faint lines of silver at his temples and an air of professional calm that was rarely broken. He remembered that night with the piercing clarity of a recurring nightmare. He was 17. Carolyn, 5 years older, was glowing. She held up her left hand, the diamond on her finger catching the light in their parents' kitchen. She and her fiancé, David Powell, were going to the Pier's Edge to celebrate their one-year engagement anniversary. It was their special place, a charming, slightly overpriced restaurant at the end of the old Port Blossom Pier, famous for its sunset views over the Pacific. Charles had teased her about being fancy, and she just laughed, ruffling his hair as she and David walked out the door, waving from their car as they drove off into the misty evening. Later that night, the storm had rolled in, a monster of wind and rain that rattled the windows and knocked out the power. The next morning, his parents got the call. Carolyn and David never came home. The police found their car still in the restaurant's parking lot. The official theory was swift and simple. They had likely gone for a walk on the pier after dinner. A massive wave, fueled by the storm, had caught them by surprise and swept them into the churning ocean. Their bodies were never recovered. The Pier's Edge restaurant, heavily damaged by the storm, was condemned. About a year later, the family heard it had been torn down, the pier left as a barren strip of wood jutting into the sea, a monument to their loss. But it never sat right with Charles. Carolyn was cautious. David was a strong swimmer. They wouldn't have been careless, not even in a moment of celebration. The explanation was too neat, too easy. The doubt took root in his 17-year-old mind and grew with him, shaping his choice of career, driving him to seek order in the untamable chaos of the ocean. The call that shattered his carefully constructed peace came on a Tuesday afternoon. The name on the caller ID was the U.S. Coast Guard. "Mr. Sanders, this is Lieutenant Robert Moore." The voice was professional, detached. "We're calling about a cold case involving your sister, Carolyn Sanders, and David Powell." Charles's grip tightened on his phone. He swiveled in his leather chair to face the window, the Seattle skyline blurring. "Yes? What about it?" "Sir, a private company was conducting a seismic survey for a new undersea communications cable about 5 miles off the coast of Port Blossom. Their sonar mapping picked up a significant structural anomaly on the seabed in an area known as the Kelp Forest Trench. We sent down an ROV, a remote-operated vehicle, to investigate." There was a pause. Charles could hear the faint crackle of the connection. "And what did you find, Lieutenant?" "We found the restaurant, sir. The Pier's Edge. It's not demolished. The entire structure is down there, almost 180 feet deep. The storm didn't just damage it. It looks like it sheared it clean off its pilings, and it sank, mostly in one piece." The air left Charles's lungs. The fortress he'd built for 25 years was gone, washed away by a single revelation. The restaurant wasn't demolished. It was sitting at the bottom of the ocean, a time capsule from the worst night of his life. "Mr. Sanders, are you still there?" "Yes," Charles said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Yes, I'm here. Given the circumstances of your sister's disappearance, we're mounting a formal survey and recovery dive. As next of kin, we wanted to inform you." Inform him. It was more than information. It was a key. A key to a locked room he'd been staring at for more than half his life. "Lieutenant," Charles said, his voice finding its strength, his lawyer's mind kicking into gear, "I want to be there. My firm specializes in maritime law and salvage rights. I can be there as a legal observer." representing my family's interests. It was a stretch, but it was a plausible one. There was another brief pause on the line. That would be unorthodox, but not unheard of. I'll see what I can do. Within 48 hours, Charles had cleared his calendar. He called his aging parents, breaking the news as gently as he could, promising to find answers. He packed a bag, the old, familiar ache in his chest now mixed with a terrifying new emotion: hope. He drove the 2 hours down the coast to Port Blossom, the town he'd avoided for 2 decades. The sky was a familiar gray, the air thick with the smell of salt and rain. He checked into a small motel and met with Lieutenant Moore at the docks the next morning. A mid-sized, capable-looking vessel named the Sea Serpent was being loaded with equipment. "This is Barbara Jenkins," Lieutenant Moore said, gesturing to a woman with a stern face and sun-bleached blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "She's the best deep-sea recovery diver on the West Coast." Barbara shook his hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes assessing him. "Mr. Sanders, I'm sorry for your loss. I'll do my best to bring you some answers." In the ship's briefing room, they watched the ROV footage on a large screen. The video was grainy, tinted green by the deep water, but it was unmistakable. There was the familiar wooden facade of the restaurant, covered in a quarter-century of marine growth. The large bay windows were dark and empty, like vacant eyes. It had settled into a deep bed of silt, which explained both why it hadn't broken apart and why traditional sonar had never found it. It was hidden in a deep trench, cloaked by sediment. "It's preserved," Barbara said, pointing at the screen. "The depth, the cold water, the lack of oxygen in the silt. It's a near-perfect anaerobic environment. Whatever is inside is going to be in a remarkable state." Charles's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of dread and anticipation. He was about to look through a window into the past, into the last place his sister was seen alive. His new mission was clear. He wasn't just here to observe. He was here to find the truth, no matter what it was, buried deep beneath the waves. The journey out to the dive site was tense and quiet. Charles stood on the deck, watching the coastline of Port Blossom recede. He could just make out the pier, a lonely finger pointing out to sea. When they arrived, the Sea Serpent positioned itself over the coordinates. The energy on the boat shifted, becoming focused and professional. Barbara and her 2-man team began their suiting up process, a ritual of checks and double checks. "We're patching you into the comms and my helmet feed," Barbara told Charles, her voice slightly muffled by her gear. "You'll see and hear everything I do. Stay in the comms room. Don't touch anything." Charles nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He took his place in the small, dark room filled with monitors, watching as the 3 divers descended into the deep blue. On the main screen, he saw the world through Barbara's eyes. The water grew darker, the sun a distant memory, until the powerful lights of her helmet cut through the gloom. And then, the restaurant emerged from the darkness. It was like a ghost ship, a building where it had no right to be. Barbara's voice crackled over the comms, calm and steady. "Approaching the main entrance, the doors are gone, likely broke off during the descent. We're going in." Charles held his breath. The camera feed moved through the doorway. The lobby was filled with floating debris and silt, but as they moved into the main dining room, the scene became clearer. Tables and chairs were scattered, overturned by the violent sinking. But some, in a more sheltered corner of the room, were still upright, their tablecloths gently waving in the current. It was a ballroom of ghosts. "We have the floor plan from the town archives," Barbara said. "Your sister's reservation was for table 7. That would be over there, by the bay windows." The light swung, and Charles's heart stopped. There it was, a single square table, somehow perfectly upright. And in the center, glinting in the beam of Barbara's light, stood a silver candelabra, its 3 arms reaching up like a skeletal hand. The plate still held the remnants of a meal. A wine glass was tipped over on its side. It was the exact scene from the photograph his parents kept on the mantel, the one David had taken of Carolyn just before the main course arrived, the candelabra sitting between them. "We see it," Charles whispered into his microphone. "That's it. That's the table." "Copy that," Barbara said. "We're moving in for a closer look." The camera moved slowly, respectfully, around the table. Charles could see 2 chairs. Both were pushed back, not neatly tucked in, but angled away from the table as if left in a hurry. Then Barbara's light panned down. On the floor, half buried in the silt beside one of the chair legs, was a dark leather object. "What is that?" Charles asked. Looks like a wallet, Barbara replied. Her partner moved in with a collection tool. We're securing it. David's wallet. It had to be. But why would it be on the floor? Then Barbara's light traced the floorboards away from the table toward what used to be the exit to the outside pier. Hold on, she said, her calm tone sharpening with interest. I'm seeing something here. There are deep gouges in the floorboards, long, parallel lines, and they're fresh relative to the sinking. They're not from the sinking itself. The silt would have covered them immediately. These look like something heavy was dragged across the floor. A chill, colder than the deep seawater on the screen, went through Charles. Rogue waves don't cause struggles inside a restaurant. They don't leave wallets on the floor or drag marks leading to the door. This was the twist, the moment the official story shattered into a million pieces. Something happened inside that restaurant. Something violent. Back on the Sea Serpent, hours later, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. The dive team had carefully recovered the wallet and a few other small items. Barbara, now out of her gear, sat with Charles and Lieutenant Moore in the briefing room. The wallet lay on the table inside a sealed evidence bag. We opened it, Moore said grimly. The contents were preserved well enough. The ID belongs to a man named Thomas Gallo, a local fisherman, or he was. He had a record for petty theft and smuggling. He was reported missing by his wife in late June 1990, just 3 days after your sister and David disappeared. It wasn't David's wallet. Charles stared at the name. Thomas Gallo. A criminal. What was his wallet doing under Carolyn's dinner table? The drag marks, the chairs pushed back, the presence of a known criminal. The picture forming in his mind was dark and terrifying. This was no accident. It was a crime scene. The next few days were a blur of activity. The case was officially reopened as a multiple homicide. Charles, using his legal standing, stayed attached to the investigation, feeding the police information from his own research. His first question was simple. What happened to the restaurant's owner? He dug through old property and business records from Port Blossom. He found the bankruptcy filing for the owner, a man named William Bates. In the filing, Bates had claimed significant costs for the storm damage and subsequent demolition of the restaurant. Charles's blood ran cold. Demolition. He cross-referenced it with the town's public works department. There was no demolition permit ever issued for the Pier's edge. No company was ever hired. The demolition claim was a complete fabrication. William Bates had lied. Finding Bates was the next step. It took Charles's private investigator less than a day. William Bates wasn't living a life of luxury from an insurance payout. He was 78 years old, living on Social Security in a state-run nursing home in a dusty inland town, hundreds of miles from the ocean. He had run away from the coast and from a terrible secret. Charles knew with absolute certainty that this frail old man held the final key. He got in his car and started driving, the underwater image of the lonely candelabra burning in his mind. He was no longer just an observer. He was a hunter. And the hunt was finally nearing its end. The nursing home smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. Charles found William Bates in a small, tidy room, sitting in a wheelchair by a window that overlooked a dusty parking lot. He was thin and pale, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the blanket covering his lap. He looked up as Charles entered, his eyes clouded with age and a deep, weary sadness. "Mr. Bates?" Charles asked, keeping his voice gentle. The old man nodded slowly. "Who are you?" "My name is Charles Sanders. My sister was Carolyn Sanders. She and her fiancé, David Powell, were at your restaurant the night it was lost, the night they disappeared." A flicker of fear, sharp and undeniable, crossed William's face. He tried to compose himself, his voice raspy. "A terrible tragedy. The storm that night. It was a monster. I lost everything." "Did you?" Charles said, pulling a chair to sit opposite him. "Because the town records show you filed for demolition costs, but the restaurant wasn't demolished, was it, William? It's been at the bottom of the ocean for 25 years. We found it." William's trembling grew more violent. His face went ashen. I don't know what you're talking about." Charles reached into his briefcase and pulled out a large, high-resolution photo. It was a still from Barbara's helmet cam, clear and haunting. The table, the half-eaten meals, and the silver candelabra standing sentinel in the deep sea gloom. He placed it on the blanket in William's lap. "We found their table, William. We found signs of a struggle. and we found a wallet belonging to a smuggler named Thomas Gallo. Now you're going to tell me what really happened that night." The old man stared at the photograph, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The image seemed to break something inside him, a dam of guilt he had maintained for a quarter of a century. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek, then another. His shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choked with emotion. "I've lived with it. Every single day." Charles waited, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment of truth. William finally looked up, his eyes meeting Charles's. The fear was gone, replaced by the hollow look of resignation. "I was in debt," he began, his voice barely audible. "Bad debt, to bad people. A crew. They ran things along this coast. Smuggling. They offered me money, a lot of it, to let them use my pier for late-night deliveries. Just turn a blind eye," they said. That night, the night of the storm, was supposed to be a drop. He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Your sister and her fiancé, they were my last customers. So happy, you know? Celebrating. I almost told them to leave, that a storm was coming, but I needed the money. They stayed late, the storm got worse, and the crew arrived early to beat the worst of it." William closed his eyes as if replaying the scene. Carolyn and David must have gone out onto the pier for some air to watch the storm roll in. They saw them. They saw the crew unloading crates from a fishing boat. It all happened so fast. The crew's leader, a man everyone feared, he wouldn't allow witnesses. They grabbed your sister and her fiancé. The confession tumbled out, a torrent of buried memories. Thomas Gallo was one of the smugglers. He must have dropped his wallet during the struggle inside the restaurant when they dragged the couple back in. Another member of the crew had argued against killing them, and the leader shot him on the spot. He was a man who left no loose ends. They took all three of them out on the boat, William stammered, tears now flowing freely, weighted them down, dropped them in the kelp forest trench, where they knew no one would ever find them. Charles felt sick. He could picture it all, Carolyn's terror, her final moments. "But the restaurant," Charles pressed, his voice cold as ice. "How did they hide a triple murder in a public place?" "That was the leader's idea," William said. "He was clever. He said the storm was a gift from God. It was the perfect cover. He had demolition experts in his crew. They planted charges on the main support pilings under the pier. They blew them, severing the whole building from the dock. The storm and the waves did the rest. It slid into the trench and was gone. To the world, it looked like the storm had just ripped it away. They paid me to stay quiet, to file for bankruptcy and create a paper trail for a demolition that never happened. They told me to disappear, or my family would be next." William's confession, recorded on Charles's phone, was the final piece of the puzzle. He gave the police the name of the crew's leader, a man who was now a powerful and seemingly legitimate shipping magnate in Portland. Armed with the confession, the physical evidence from the wreck, and 25 years of cold fury, the authorities moved in. The arrests were quiet and swift. The magnate and the other surviving crew member, now old men, never expected their past to wash ashore. A month later, Charles stood on the cliffs overlooking Port Blossom. There was no funeral, as there were still no bodies to bury. Instead, he held a memorial. His parents stood beside him, frail but relieved. Barbara Jenkins and Lieutenant Moore were there too. They watched as Charles tossed a bouquet of white lilies, Carolyn's favorite, into the ocean. The flowers bobbed on the waves, drifting out toward the deep, silent place where his sister's story had finally been found. The ghost was gone. The pain would always be a part of him, a scar in his soul, but it no longer defined him. For the first time in 25 years, when he thought of Carolyn, he didn't feel the cold dread of the unknown. He just remembered her smile, the diamond on her finger, and the light in her eyes as she walked out the door, full of hope, on that long-ago summer night. He had found the truth. He had brought her justice. And finally, Charles Sanders could let his sister rest in peace. William Bates kept his secret for 25 years, living with the guilt every single day. Do you think a person in his situation, under threat and in debt, could ever truly be forgiven for their silence? Let me know your thoughts on this difficult question. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. We explore the hidden stories and unanswered questions that remind us of the enduring power of truth. Thank you for listening.